With the start of the anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive, the Ukrainian war experienced a new turning point. The soldiers of the Ukrainian army, equipped with modern Western weapons, passed the Russian positions and defensive fortifications one by one, liberating 8 villages. In the 2 weeks since the start of the counteroffensive and making an advance of 1,000 kilometers in diameter. Although Russian President Vladimir Putin denies that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has begun, rising Russian casualties suggest the opposite. Recently, a Kremlin official who did not want to be named claimed that the Russian Defense Ministry had not communicated the Russian casualties to President Putin, and that Putin still thought the superiority of the war was in the Russian army. When the Russian army casualties are compared with President Putin's statements, the Kremlin official's claims may reflect the truth. There are many reasons why the Russian army is in such a devastated state. Among these reasons are the modern Western weapons of the Ukrainian army and well-trained Ukrainian soldiers, as well as the complete loss of combat motivation of the Russian army after the Prigozhin rebellion. The Ukrainian counterattack, which continued for months with the right strategies, made its greatest progress during the Ukrainian war. For reasons we have listed here in this news, we will tell you the course of the Ukrainian counterattack and what strategies the Ukrainian army follows. The Ukrainian troops took into account the conflict between the Wagner Special Military Division and the Russian authorities while continuing their offensive actions in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry reported that the offensive actions on the Bakhmut front have continued for 4 days. Ukrainian forces are gradually but confidently advancing on the flanks each day without entering the city of Bakhmut. The ministry explained that the counterattack operation on this front has a feature that complicates the liberation process. The city of Bakhmut and the surrounding region have a sophisticated system of engineering fortifications and a sophisticated network of strongpoints. All this was previously prepared for defense by the Ukrainian army and local authorities. However, these fortifications and strongpoints are currently controlled by the Russians, so liberating these areas requires more effort and patience. The tactics chosen by the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, for the offensive are quite effective, as can be clearly seen in the operational areas. The reserve colonel of the Armed Forces of Ukraine and pilot instructor, military expert Roman Svedin, said that as before, Zaluzhny has well positioned his troops for the most difficult operations. Svedin noted that the successful execution of General Zaluzhny counterattack plans were successful, refuting Putin's words, denying the counterattack. Indeed, for Putin, Zaluzhny has left Ukraine and is hiding abroad. But in reality, the general is at the head of his army in Ukraine and is leading the counterattack in the best way possible. It is clear that Russian President Vladimir Putin has problems with his perception of reality. It is no longer possible to distinguish which speeches are made in Ukraine or abroad. This is a clear example of Putin's continued disdain for the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian military. But as the battlefield is a graveyard for Russian soldiers, President Putin's misjudgments are not only demoralizing his soldiers, but also leading to the Ukrainian advance. So what offensive tactics did Zaluzhny choose? Ukrainian army officials said that Zaluzhny chose the right and effective counterattack tactics. Ukrainian forces launched flanking attacks to cordon off, destroy or capture the Russians' first line of defense. Meanwhile, this first Russian line calls for support for Russian troops from the second front line. The armed forces of Ukraine provoke the Russians to make such a move in order to destroy them with the help of artillery on the move. At this point, it is hardly surprising that Ukrainian troops liquidated 1,000 Russians in one day. This means that 1,000 Russians are seriously injured and will not return to the battlefield, and their ammunition is liquidated. So what measures did the Russians take against this strategy? According to Ukrainian military officials, the Russians are trying to attract the Ukrainian armed forces to places that are more difficult for them, and accordingly, it is easier for them to procure equipment. That is why the armed forces of Ukraine work near Orikhiv, where the Ukrainian logistics are the shortest route. We can observe this best in Bakhmut. As expected, recently, Prigozhin set up a trap for the Russian troops in Bakhmut. Seeing that the blockade of the Ukrainian army had begun, he withdrew his troops and was replaced by inexperienced, mobilized soldiers. This has become one of the main reasons for the bad behavior of the Russians in Bakhmut. Bakhmut 100% losing direction for the Russians. New. North of Bakhmut, the Ukrainian armed forces take over Russian-controlled areas, as in the south of Ukraine. Sooner or later, the Russians will have to leave because they are surrounded. Troops here will probably be moved to Popasna, and from there to places where the Russian defense lines are concentrated. But in Bakhmut current situation, the entrances and exits to the city are blocked by the Ukrainian army. Successful strategies by Ukrainian military planners allowed the Ukrainian army to advance on both the eastern and western fronts. But the main advances of the Ukrainian army were on the southern front, where defense lines were relatively weaker than on the eastern front. This floating Zaporizhia direction became a serious front where the Ukrainian troops used the bulk of their strength to try to break through the Russian defenses, sending dozens of armored vehicles to the war. The Ukrainian army is giving the Russian army a hard time in the city of Orikhiv and nearby settlements. According to Ukrainian officials, with the support of the 70th Regiment of the Russian Army, the fighters of the 291st Regiment, along with intelligence, special forces, pilots and artillerymen, have difficulty resisting the attacks of the Ukrainian army. Canadian forces managed to infiltrate the front trenches of the Russian army. Although the Russian troops suffered heavy losses, they are trying to strengthen their remaining positions. The Ukrainian army continues to bring new units into the operation to maintain and expand control over the region. The situation in Robertino became so complicated that the Russian troops had to leave their positions and retreat. The Ukrainian army captured most of the Russian positions in this region and made quite good progress. However, the Russian defense forces do not hesitate to retaliate against the strong attacks of the Ukrainian army. The Russian Air Force is actively acting to suppress the Ukrainian forces and the advance of the army. But the use of surface-to-air missiles by Ukrainian strike units is frustrating the efforts of the Russian Air Force. In general, the tension in the region is very high. The morale of the Russian troops who could not stop the advance of the Ukrainian army has collapsed. The Ukrainian army is attacking various spots of the Russian defense line, searching for weak spots in the Donbass and southern Ukraine. Kiev has not yet made a statement, but all offensive forces are now on the ground and are actively advancing. So what's going on in Donbass? Fierce fighting is raging in the southern part of Donbass, where Ukrainian forces are attacking Russian defensive lines. The Ukrainian army made great progress with the support of both infantry and mechanized units as well as artillery units. But dealing with the Russian defensive fortifications is slowing the Ukrainian advance somewhat. The Russian forces have built the largest line of defensive fortifications in recent history. Since rumors of a Ukrainian counterattack broke out months ago, most of these fortifications consist of 3 or 4 lines of defense. Generally, the first 2 lines of defense are designed to be passed by the attacker, but to slow him down and direct attacking units into better defended areas. But despite the ongoing Ukrainian counterattack, the Kremlin still thinks it has the initiative. For more than a century, the tank has been a key symbol of ground operations firepower. Warplanes can destroy the battlefield from the air, but he can never seize and control the land. An infantry element accompanied by tanks and armored vehicles is inevitable for capture, as seen in the Ukraine-Russia war. The infantry is of the highest order. If you don't have enough armored vehicles for your infantry, your soldiers won't survive for long. Let's take a look at the losses of the 10th Tank Regiment and the effects of these losses on the soldiers. Russia is focusing its efforts on besieging Avdiivka, a town in eastern Ukraine. Avdiivka, located approximately 136 kilometers south of Bakhmut, becomes the focal point of the Russian forces. Russian troops' gains in the region were limited and progress was slow and costly. Vladimir Putin's army made only marginal progress in the offensive in the Donetsk province at the expense of heavy losses in armored vehicles. The Russian military leadership has deployed some Kremlin-backed private military mercenary Wagner Group elements in this area to reinforce their last limited advance in the city. The 10th Tank Regiment probably lost most of its tanks while trying to encircle Avdiivka from the south. The losses of the 10th Tank Regiment are most likely due to tactically flawed frontal attacks similar to those in other recently unsuccessful Russian armored attacks such as around the town of Bulaya. We talked about some flawed tactics and tank losses in Avdiivka. So what might these flawed tactics be? Let's explore this question. The mechanized infantry, together with the tanks, form the core of the armored units as the combat effectiveness of tank units not supported by mechanized infantry decreases. Tank losses increase because although the tank is very strong, it is a vehicle that also has weaknesses. Mechanized infantry guards, the weak sides of tanks, watch their flanks and rear, destroy anti-tank guns and tank destroyers in places that restrict the view and movement of tanks, such as in densely forested areas. Mechanized infantry units provide tanks with both close protection and situational awareness. If the infantry fails to fulfill these duties, it is considered tactically defective. As a result of this defect, serious problems such as losing a tank occur. This is how we can summarize the general problem in the Russian army. After the tank losses in Avdiivka, Belohorivka near the Donetsk Oblast is another region where the Russian army suffered tank losses. A 31-second video posted on social media captured the moment when a Russian BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle was targeted by an anti-tank guided missile near the village of Belohorivka. Ukraine's 10th Mountain Assault Brigade neutralized the IFV while advancing over open terrain. When the ADM hit it, the Russian BMP-1 appeared to have stopped with absolutely no cover. An explosion engulfed the IFV, which was left on the field as a burning hulk. There were no survivors from the vehicle. Belohorivka has been a place of intense fighting since Russia launched its invasion for no reason a year ago. Belohorivka is about 88 kilometers northwest of Luhansk city center and about 25 kilometers southwest of Severodonetsk. Founded decades before the United States became a country, the town has changed hands several times in recent months, so much so that, according to the latest reports, there is literally nothing left. It was the scene of fighting from early May to July when Russia took full control of the town. In September, Ukraine liberated Belohorivka. However, it was subjected to constant shelling before being captured by Kremlin forces in early February. The town was liberated again days later. The town is now one of the last pots of Luhansk Oblast to remain under Ukrainian control, and Moscow seems determined to recapture Belohorivka. While intense clashes have continued on the settlements of Kremenna, Verskaya and Spurna in recent days, the city of Bakhmut continues to be the epicenter of hostilities in the region. Russia has suffered heavy losses in recent conflicts and has at times shown little or no mercy when it comes to casualties. Increasingly unprepared conscripts are thrown into the war, and Moscow instead has a high tolerance for casualties. Victory or death seems to be the Kremlin's strategy. In recent conflicts, Russia's arsenal of manpower and, more importantly, modern equipment is not inexhaustible. Footage has emerged this week showing the Cold War-era T-62 on trains to Ukraine, while Moscow has to use old equipment like the BMP-1 destroyed in the latest video. Likewise, there are even reports that old T-54-55 series tanks may be sent to the front. As it is known, Ukraine claimed that Russia lost 21 tanks in a single day earlier this month. Russia has also had to rely on old tank models after the new tanks were destroyed. This includes an elite Russian unit fighting 60-year-old T-62 tanks. If this is indeed the case, we will likely see more videos of Russian vehicles destroyed in the Ukrainian countryside. It is also believed that Russia has lost at least 2,000 tanks since Vladimir Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine in February last year. According to Western analysts said that in the 13 months since the invasion, a total of about 10,000 military equipment, including armored vehicles and artillery howitzers, has been lost by Russian forces. On the other hand, the 10th Tank Regiment, which we described at the beginning of the video, is part of the 3rd Army Corps, was the first major new formation that Russia has stood up to support the invasion of Ukraine since August 2022. Numerous open-source accounts have suggested that the 3rd Army Corps is dealing with particularly PO discipline and PO morale issues, despite a possible training period in Belarus. The formation still appears to exhibit limited combat effectiveness. According to Ukrainian sources, soldiers from the newly formed 3rd Army Corps are often drunk, use outdated weapons, and receive inadequate training. In Belarus, as it is known, the cracks in the Russian army came to light a long time ago with insufficient equipment and training. Russian soldiers ran out of patience. The Russian forces also suffered a series of humiliating defeats on the front lines while also reeling from ammunition losses. The supply shortages in the Russian army broke the motivation of the soldiers demotivated. Soldiers made tactically flawed moves on the front lines. A question comes to mind here. Do losses disrupt the psychology of the soldier and the army, or does the already broken psychology increase the losses? What if there's a third possibility, and both reasons support each other? We would be glad if you let us know your thoughts in the comments. In the past month, we have frequently witnessed chaos and riots in the Russian army. If you remember, some video footage published on social media platforms last month clearly revealed the problems experienced in the Russian army. The cracks in the Moscow army came to light when it was revealed that Russian soldiers were pointing guns at each other in their drunken demonstrations. They described numerous cases of drunken behavior and random atrocities among soldiers, officers, and troops serving in the Russian army. The final chaos in the Moscow army took place in the 392nd Motor Rifle Regiment. The main protagonist of the event were again a handful of drunken Russian soldiers in an argument between drunken Russian soldiers. A soldier shot a bullet in the head of his friend with a machine gun, causing his death. This growing unrest and disobedience in the Russian army will accelerate the dissolution of the Russian army, which is already in a defeated psychology. First of all, the invasions will stop. Then the negotiations that are planned to be profitable for the Russian side will be discussed, and then the withdrawal of the Russian army will accelerate. In this process, which has evolved from war and occupation to victory, the duty of the Ukrainian soldier is to continue the resistance with the same determination. If the Ukrainian military forces continue their determined resistance, they will easily challenge the Russian army. This challenge will fuel the fire of rebellion within the Russian troops. Is it possible for Russian troops to have success on the front lines while grappling with the rebellion? We'll see this in the coming days.